everybody. If you'd like to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians, we're going to be looking at chapter 9 tonight, continuing our study through the Scriptures here, trying to gain spiritual knowledge and strength as we look at what Paul has to say here to this church. Think back just for a moment. It's been now several weeks since we started this, about this actual congregation of people that lived 2,000 years ago in this town called Corinth. And again, just as a reminder, Corinth was a very prosperous town, lived on the edge of a seacoast. Any prosperous seacoast town has all kinds of things happening in it. Just by the influx of finances and what have you, there are going to be a lot of different kinds of people. Military people, a lot of immoral people, a lot of influence, a lot of cultural people in that area because it's Greece. And Greece has a tremendous amount of influence of philosophies and culture, etc. And so the church has now come out of that kind of a background. And they're living in a place, wow, maybe more like San Francisco or Los Angeles would be today, with all of the imaginative things that you might gain from from what you heard about in those areas. A lot of influence then in that area on the church itself. And the people that are in that congregation came out of a background, probably what you would say was kind of rough. A lot of immorality, a lot of confusion about pagan backgrounds. And for the last couple of chapters, we were looking at some things that Paul was addressing, particularly because of the youngness of the church. They didn't know what to do with Christianity. They came out of a pagan background. And the whole congregation, you've never really seen this happen because any of us that have come or gone almost anywhere have joined ourselves to a group or a church that, for the most part, has some kind of background where it's been going for some period of time. Whereas this is a whole brand new group of Christians. And how do you treat one another? And as we looked at chapter 7, what is marriage like? And what does it take to constitute marriage? And, well, what if my marriage is with a person that's not a Christian? Because if, one person becomes a Christian out of the pagan background and the other person doesn't, what am I supposed to do with my mate? And all these different questions they had about this. And so, chapter 7, we dealt with marriage matters, a variety of things. In chapter 8, big and small matters, and the understanding of what it's like to have one and not the other, and what do you do? And how do you discern between big matters and small matters, and how do you treat these things? Now, as we come to chapter 9, we're dealing with, I guess you could say, personal and doctrinal matters. Some of them very, very personal for Paul, and some of them generally just some ideas of doctrine. And so that's what we're looking at as Paul is writing answers and directions and information to this church. Chapter 9 is probably not particularly concerning questions like in chapter 7, verse 1, where Paul says, now, about the things you wrote me, I'm going to give you some answers. But nonetheless, there's some information they need to know. So Paul is going to address some matters, I think you might say, about his apostleship, about what is doctrinally correct concerning paying ministers of all things. That pertains to us as a congregation, because we do that. You probably never stop to think, where's the justification in doing that? Because we ought to be able to find scriptures within the Bible that defend or demonstrate what we ought to be doing in a variety of ways, and one of those is paying people. Is that correct or not? Another one is about maintaining a good attitude as far as reaching out to souls. And so Paul deals with a variety of things, and I'm going to attempt to go through the entire chapter and just kind of touch upon each one of these things, not in great depth, but dealing with that. Well, Paul starts out, first of all, with a defense of his apostleship as it stands, and then some of the personal rights that he thinks he has as we begin here now in verse 1. He says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? And are you not my work in the Lord? In other words, really a proof of his apostleship. If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal, or in other words, the proof of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me in this, and do we not have the right to eat and drink? We'll pause right there for just a moment. Well, let's read verses 5 and 6 as we tie it all together. And do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of our Lord, and Cephas, in other words, Peter here? Or is it only Barnabas and I, Paul's talking now again, who have no right to refrain from working? Well, there's a question that some have. As Paul went about doing his mission work, when he'd leave to go on to another place, other people would move in. And sometimes people that moved in were maybe mature Christians more than those within the congregation were there, but they weren't of apostleship status. But to gain some kind of authority and the groundwork within the congregation to look important, they would start putting down Paul's apostleship. And you think, really? Well, yes. And what they were trying to do in the effort there is to gain some communication within the people, or authority within the people, is saying, well, Paul really wasn't a real apostle. He wasn't back there with the original 12. He kind of came along sometime afterwards, and he's kind of a quasi-apostle, not really an apostle like Peter and James and John and all of those. He kind of fell in line. And matter of fact, if you read some of his writings, he'll even talk about he doesn't really deserve to get to be an apostle like those guys. And so Paul would have to stop and prove his apostleship. Now, he's not concerned so much about himself as an individual, but what he is concerned about is the authority of his writings. And when he gives them direction, that they understand this is not coming from some guy over here that's philosophizing or dreaming up ideas or giving them suggestions, but it's coming from God himself. So he has to prove this. So when you look back over in chapter 1 of this letter, in verse 1, the very first thing Paul says in this letter is Paul called to be an apostle. Later on, he'll talk about some other things, but he's establishing something for them to realize right up front. Not every letter starts like that Paul writes. Occasionally, he'll mention being an apostle and also a servant, and tie in Timothy if he's along with him as he's writing. But here's one strong point that he wants to establish. In chapter 2, verse 1, as he's still recognizing his credibility and authority as an apostle, he says, "Brethren, when I came to you, I didn't come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God, for I was determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." So the strength of his apostleship comes because of his connection with Jesus and what Jesus has died for. Well, because of these things here, it seems like that people were beginning to take for granted his apostleship, putting him down. And they were looking to really gain way as far as being leaders in the church, really to influence the church in the wrong direction. But in order to do that, they had to put down Paul's authority. The scoffers then came in. So Paul demonstrates he's being called to be an apostle and doing this. Now, part of this also comes about because, as you remember, look over at chapter 18 for just a minute, in the book of Acts. As Paul is talking about, or really Luke is writing about Paul's missionary journeys in chapter 18, he talks about when he came to Corinth, Paul coming into Corinth, verse 1, and he connects up verse 2 with a certain person named Aquila, born of Pontus, and he got with Priscilla, the wife. In verse 3 it says, and they did this because he was of the same trade. Trade of what? That Apostle Paul had. So he stayed with them, and as Paul did, and they worked together, for by occupation they were, all of them, tent makers. So when Paul comes into Corinth, rather than asking for support from all these different places like missionaries might do, Paul says, no, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to establish who I am, whatever, and I'm going to do what I was trained secondary to do, that's tent making. So when I come in and do these things, I don't have to draw off of anybody's needs or help or whatever. Let them take care of those things in another place, and I'll survive by what I can make myself. And what happens is he's doing this in Corinth. Later on, some people will come along and say, why, he's not even an apostle. He doesn't even get money for being an apostle like Peter. He's not even married like Peter and others. And so he's not really an apostle. And so Paul says, okay, y'all, I didn't take any money from you like I could have. I have a right. And so when you go back to this letter here, he says, do I now have a right to eat and drink? In other words, to gain money from you, from my own, from you to take care of my living, or to be sustained in another way. So as he's going through here, he's demonstrating his authority for apostleship regardless of how he started out in the tent making in that area. As you move through the rest of this, however, Paul, by inspiration, lays out that there is authority for paying ministers or whoever is working in the church, using church funds to take care of church needs. So look at verse 7. As he's dealing with this, he goes back and he gives an analogy here about just stately things, government things. He says, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its own fruit, or who tends the flock and does not drink the milk of the flock. In verse 8, then he says, now do I say these things as mere man, or does not the law, go back to the Old Testament now, the law itself say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, for you shall not muzzle out the ox while it's treading out the grain. Now that's an Old Testament law. And then he makes the point about that. He says, is it the oxen that God's worried about? So he's measuring out what the farmer understands as they're going along. And he says, but I want you to see what's going on here, because God's people are to take care of people that are tending God's people in whatever way. Verse 10, so, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, he continues on, answering his own question. For our sakes, no doubt, that it is written that he who plows, should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. Now, if we've sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your spiritual things? If others are partakers of this right over you, naming Peter and a few others, if they're doing this, are we not even more? Now, not that he's a greater apostle, but the fact is, Paul was right there in Corinth. And if they get a chance to do that, do we not even get to do it even more here in our own hometown where we helped you? Nevertheless, he says, we have not used this right. And he's making the distinction. He's not saying we didn't have this right. What he's saying is we didn't take advantage. We didn't use this right. But we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel. Maybe the people didn't have it, and so he didn't ask for it. Maybe they were sending it somewhere else and taking care of other needs. But Paul relied on his own occupation as a tent maker to take care of things, and he still stayed there and he established a church and built quite a good congregation. Now, because of that, other people coming in, sowing discord among the people, as you read about in the first part of 1 Corinthians and other things, has tried to claim that Paul really doesn't have any authority. So when they stand up and read this letter that we're looking at right now, they want to scoff at the potential of it really saying anything, and they want him to throw it out. So Paul has to establish in and out of this letter his apostleship and a demonstration that he's speaking for God and not just for himself. So it's kind of a trivial thing in one sense, but what it does for us in this day and time, not worried about Paul's defense because we know he's an apostle, but he also demonstrates a principle here about paying preachers or other church workers, youth ministers, elders that are full-time, or anybody else that's working within the church for the growth of the church, for the work of the church, in whatever direction that might be determined. He does not, you might notice here, define a salary. He does not say about hours. He doesn't talk about this work over that work, but he just talks about the principle that's there, leaving it up to the congregation to decide how they go about determining the details of that, and he demonstrates it only as a privilege or a right. It doesn't have to be done, but could be done. Either way, in other words, is okay. So there's Paul's matter as far as that goes. Now, to me, one of the neatest passages is the next part coming through here. I'm going to skip over some of this. No, I'm not either. I've got to read some of this because this is so important. I'm going to come back to this. All right, so as Paul is demonstrating what's going on here, I'm going to jump in on verse 14. He says, "So even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel." Not that they have to, but he's commanded that it is possible to do. "But I have not used none of these things, nor have I written these things that I should have done it. So for it would be better for me to die than to have anyone should make my boasting void." See, he liked bragging about the fact, I didn't rely on you. I made this on my own. Did it myself. But verse 16, he says, "But if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me." He said, in other words, God's laid this on me. I just got to do it this way. He says, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." He's not concerned about finances. He's concerned about gospel, as we'll get into this next part here. "But if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will," and I guess maybe there's some that preach the gospel against their will. That's kind of strange. But "I have been entrusted with stewardship. Then what's my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel." Coming back to that. Now this next little section here, verse 19-23. "For though I am free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." Now he's talking about himself personally and an attitude here. If I were looking at this category, I'd call it all things to all men, to save some. "To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those under the law," that's a Jewish background, "as under the law, that I might win those under the law." Now we'll switch to talk about other categories of people he's been to. "To those who are without the law," that's of the non-Jewish background, the pagans in other areas where he's going to also. "To those as without the law," not being without the law toward God, not God's law, but just general laws, "but under a law toward Christ, that I might win those who are under the law." He said, "What are you talking about, Paul?" Well, he says, I'm going about in a lot of different mission works. And when I go into an area, there's a lot of people with a lot of different customs. The Jewish people have this kind of a custom. I'm going to adapt and I'm going to do that. He's not going through and obeying all the laws and commanding the Jewish laws. But the customs and the principles, I'm going to go right along with them. I don't want to offend anybody. If they want to do this way and they want to wash their hands that way, I'm going to go right along with them. And when I go over here to the pagan people, no, I'm not going to be worshiping idols and doing all those things, but I'm going to fit in with them as best I can. So to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those that are not of Jewish background, I'm going to do all I can. Having studied mission work for a number of years and having a master's degree, not a big deal. But the principle is that I've looked at this so many times from so many angles and thought about the beauty that's being described here that applies to us as Christians, not just to mission works. That wherever we go in life, whether it's overseas or across the fence to the neighbor next door, that we try our best to not be the obstacle for the gospel to get to them. That we identify with them. And if they like to do thus and so, well, I'm going to fit in, I'm going to be friends with you, and we're going to learn to do this together. Just general stuff. Not talking about things that are unscriptural that you go on and identify with, morals or anything else, but just how they like to cook or how they like to behave or what they like to eat or anything else. To be like they are to them, so you've got a bond between them. And when you begin to discuss the gospel with them, they're talking to a friend now, not just some stranger out there. And this is what Paul's talking about. So verse 22, he kind of capsulizes it in what he says here. He says, to the weak, I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. He didn't say all. It's not going to happen. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. There's such an important principle being described here for us as Christians. In trying to make sure that everything that we do helps the gospel to communicate to individuals. In not applying this to unscriptural things in any way, but applying it to anything that would fit in demonstrating our love for them, making sure that we communicate the gospel in the same way. Churches have lost recently for two different things. Number one, they looked at this general principle, whether using it or not using it, and they will do all that they can to attract anybody and everybody, including changing services, rearranging anything and everything, and doing things that aren't scriptural. Paul is not talking about that. That's not his point at all in that. Matter of fact, when we change and make our goal attracting numbers and not preaching the gospel, we lose our focus. The numbers are important. I'm always excited when the auditorium's full, and I'll do what I can to make it go the right way. Making my preaching something I think is effective, and Craig and I talk sometimes about service and what we can do to kind of make things a little bit different to really just make it more meaningful. But we don't go about doing it so we'll be drawing in numbers. Oh, we can hang a poster out there, most lively, whatever. No, that's not it. Nor in anything else we might do that would demonstrate our goal is numbers and not Jesus. On the other side, there's another sad thing, and that's the situation where nobody cares. I'm going to be what I'm going to be just the way God made me. I'm not changing. Don't need to. And we lose a great opportunity of being able to identify with people and helping reach into their lives, even to our own brethren. That principle of becoming all things to all men is not just for preachers or just for missionaries. But it's a matter of us being able to understand that we're family. And when we sit down with family at Christmas time or Thanksgiving and right around the corner all those holidays, you sit down with people that don't see things just exactly the way you do. But you go on and celebrate holidays together anyway. Because you're family. We need to understand that need to make sure that the gospel gets out, that the family grows, the family is strengthened, that we reach out to one another. And so those two principles are extremely important. Now the last part of this section here, which is also so rich and full of encouragement and all. Verse 24. Do you not know? I like the way he starts this. It's kind of like, he could have just as well said, okay, you Corinthians, let's try to get this straight. They ought to know, in other words. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run? But one who receives the prize, only one, question mark. Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Yeah. Everybody's out there running, but only one receives a prize. Did you not know that? Well, yeah. Well, think about that, he says, when you're thinking about the Christian life. And then he kind of adds to it here. Verse 25. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. He's disciplined. He's organized. He's working hard. Man, these Olympic commercials, when they start talking about these athletes and how early they get up in the morning and do all these things. I mean, they're going at it to win. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown. But we, for an imperishable crown, one that never is going away. Therefore, I run thus, he says, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight. And he uses another parallel. Not as one who's just out boxing in the air, in other words. But I discipline my body. And I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself might become disqualified. Most often when Paul is talking about our movement physically, he'll talk about walk, the Christian walk. Romans chapter 4, verse 12, he talks about walking in the steps of faith. Romans chapter 6, verse 4, he'll talk about walking in newness of life. Romans 8, verse 4, he'll talk about walking not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Ephesians chapter 5, 3 times in there, he'll deal with the idea of walk. Walk in love. Walk not as children of light. Continue on with this principle of walking. He's not looking now for us to step up the pace. All right, guys, let's shift gears. Let's get moving. We're going to run today. But he's talking about this idea of competition. It's just a totally different metaphor. But he's dealing with an issue here. Number one, when we get into a race, we run because we want to win it. Now, setting aside me when I go out to one of these little marathons, and it's the 5K or the 10K, I run so when I get to the end of it, I can say, I competed, okay? I'm not going to win that race. I know that. Those guys that have some real unusual names that come over from wherever that are real trim and thin, that have those special shoes, they're going to win the race, not me. But I'm getting into shape and doing good. But he's talking about the people that are really at it. And he talks about us as Christians with the same idea. We're supposed to be trying to do something here. We're not just joining in just to meander around now. This is not a walk. This is serious business. We run for a prize. To do that, number one, then, we're going to have to understand the prize can be won or the prize can be lost. Sometimes you can be disqualified because you don't run according to the rules. And he'll deal with these things. He'll talk, or others will talk about it in the Hebrew letter. But this issue of running the Christian race is something important and serious. And the prize can be done. And as he's dealing with all this, the last part he's dealing with, talking about here is there's effort and discipline involved in making it. Not a lot of effort and discipline involving getting up and coming to church. A little bit. You could say yes or you could say no. You said yes, you're back here tonight. But the point's more serious than that. We got to have goals out there. We got to have discipline toward achieving those goals. We don't just float through life and maybe someday the Lord will bring somebody right down and the pages of the gospel will just spin open and there it's going to be right there and I'll read the perfect passage and I'll win a soul. It takes discipline. It takes work. On the other side, we could also lose our souls if we're not careful in how we're going about this. And thus he says, I discipline my body. Now this is the Apostle Paul. He's established his authority and his apostleship. He says, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to all the other people, I myself might be disqualified. Any one of us, you see, as Paul looks at this seriously. Understanding the power of Satan and how effective he is. And he's helping himself to see this, but he's also relating to the Corinthian people this matter that any one of us, you see, if we're not serious about this, in this matter, we can lose. Christianity is so important. So Paul defends apostleship. He'll demonstrate the fact that we should try as best we can, becoming all things to all men. Our goal is to save some. And then a reminder along with that it's going to take disciplined effort in order to get there. For us personally and for reaching the goals of talking to other people. Personal and doctrinal matters, as Paul's dealing with it. We'll come to some other things in a few chapters ahead here as we look at it, but go back and read it again. See what he's saying in here, because this is a church that's a lot like church in our society today, with the same struggles and the same issues. And as we're looking at this, it's something for us to understand that what Paul writes about is serious. It's coming from God. God's not just out there just throwing out letters for us to read and examine and say, oh, that's good, and forget about it. There's an application of who we are and how important it is for us to understand. And our goal is to get souls to heaven, ourselves included. Hope this encourages you to stay strong, continue in the gospel, and to make sure that you're doing what you can do in bringing others to Christ. As we close the lesson, you need prayer for the church, need help, you need to repent of something, you need to become and be baptized. A lot of needs, a lot of different things happening in the lives of individuals. If you had a need to do something openly, out front, in front of everybody else, we're here to help you. Whatever your need is, come while we stand and sing.